Archaeologists were surprised to find that whoever collected the Dead Sea Scrolls considered the Book of Enoch to be of vital importance, preserving 11 different manuscripts. Users recently fed the Book of Enoch, a text cut from the Western Bible, into Grok, the AI built by Elon Musk's X AI. What Grok found hidden inside is genuinely hard to believe. Not a legend, not a theory. A precise connection between this forbidden book and the title Jesus used for himself roughly 80 times. A connection most churchgoers have never been shown. And that was only the first discovery. A named roster of fallen angels. An ancient calendar buried with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And one question that has never been answered. Why was this book erased? The forbidden book. You know, the longest and only unambiguous quotation in the biblical Epistle of Jude is not from the Old Testament, but rather from the non-biblical book of 1 Enoch. The story of this book is strange before a single angel appears in it. The Book of Enoch, also called 1 Enoch, is an ancient Jewish religious work attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah. Scholars generally date its composition somewhere between 300 and 100 BCE. Though many believe portions are considerably older. Across its pages, Enoch travels through the heavens, speaks with angels, both faithful and fallen, and receives sweeping visions covering the judgment of the world, the architecture of the cosmos, and the end of history itself. And it has gained a lot of traction lately, not just among Christians, but also among those who are into New Age and other religions. Yet for most of Western Christianity, this book effectively does not exist. It was left out of the Bible during the era of the early church. And for well over 1,000 years, the full text was essentially unknown in the West. It survived in one place. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the complete book within its official scripture. Written in the ancient liturgical language of Jess, that single unbroken chain of preservation is the only reason the full text exists today. The Scottish explorer James Bruce carried copies back from Ethiopia in 1773, and Europe got its first real look at a book its own churches had abandoned more than a millennium earlier. The stakes of that exclusion are higher than they first appear. The Book of Enoch is directly quoted in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude cites it almost word for word, and many scholars believe it shaped the thinking of the New Testament writers far more broadly than that single quotation suggests. It is almost certain that Jesus and his followers knew this text well. It circulated in their world. It shaped the religious imagination of their generation. Which leaves one question hanging over everything. Why was it cut? Was it too extreme? Too specific? Or did it contain ideas that religious authorities preferred to keep out of circulation? That unresolved question is exactly what pushed people toward an unusual experiment. Take the oldest surviving witness to this tradition. Hand it to a machine with no doctrine to defend and watch what patterns rise to the surface. The machine reads, Grok 4. This is the latest artificial intelligence system. And let me be very, very clear. Grok is the AI system developed by XAI, launched in late 2023, and generally described as more willing than some competitors to engage with unconventional territory. Under the hood, it does what large language models do. It reads enormous amounts of text, spots themes, compares literary structures, and explains complex ideas in plain language. Using computers to study ancient scripture is not new. Computational tools have been applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Torah, and the New Testament for years. What changed with a conversational system like Grok is access. Ordinary readers, not just scholars with journal subscriptions and reading knowledge of Aramaic, can now put layered questions to an ancient text and receive substantive answers in seconds. The system can line up chapters, trace recurring symbols, and unpack theological arguments in everyday terms. When people started doing exactly that with the Book of Enoch, something interesting happened. Grok did not just condense the book. It surfaced structural patterns, thematic groupings, and points of theological tension that had mostly stayed buried in academic papers few people ever read. It traced links between Enoch and other ancient traditions from Mesopotamian mythology to the Dead Sea Scrolls in ways that felt genuinely illuminating rather than superficial. Precision matters here because precision is where this story earns its weight. Grok was not making supernatural claims. It was finding patterns in language and expressing connections clearly. But when the source material is something as dense as old and as deliberately sidelined as 1 Enoch, those patterns turn out to be unusually compelling. The Watchers descend. It expounds on Genesis 6, E's 1-4, when the story is begun that the Watchers descended upon earth. 1. Of the first things Grok zeroed in on was the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers, spanning chapters 1 through 36. This is not a minor subplot. It is the entire foundation of the book's opening act. It introduces a group of heavenly beings called the Watchers. Originally assigned to observe humanity, who instead chose to descend to Earth, take human wives and father hybrid offspring known as the Nephilim. Grok treated this section as the interpretive key to the entire book, and for good reason. Grok pointed out that this narrative connects directly to and dramatically expands a handful of cryptic verses in Genesis 6 where sons of God take human wives and produce giants. Verses that have puzzled readers for more than 2,000 years. But Enoch goes much further than Genesis ever dares. It names the Watchers individually. It identifies their leader as Samjaza, and it details the forbidden knowledge these beings handed down to humanity. Metalwork, cosmetics, sorcery, the reading of the stars. In Enoch's telling, civilization's most dangerous skills did not evolve slowly. They were delivered, taught, handed across a boundary that was never supposed to be crossed. The analysis then surfaced something scholars have discussed for decades, laid out with unusual clarity. The Watcher story closely mirrors Mesopotamian traditions about the Akalu, semi-divine beings in Sumerian and Babylonian mythology, said to have descended from the heavens to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The overlap between the two traditions is close enough that some researchers believe both trace back to an even older shared source, a story so ancient it predates the cultures that recorded it. The machine's contribution was not a new discovery. It was the ability to hold these cross-cultural connections side by side and lay out the overlaps clearly for readers who would otherwise need to work through several separate fields of study just to see the pattern. Then there are the Nephilim themselves. Enoch describes the offspring of the Watchers and human women as giants who consumed everything humanity produced, then turned on the people and finally turned on one another. When they died, the text says their disembodied spirits remained on the earth as the evil forces that still torment humanity. The Book of Enoch is offering an origin story for demons. The canonical Bible mentions the Nephilim, but never explains what became of them, and it never explains where evil spirits came from in the first place. Enoch answers both questions in a single sweep. For an ancient audience wrestling with the problem of evil, that explanatory power alone would have made the book almost impossible to ignore. The same archetype travels remarkably far. Powerful corrupting hybrid beings appear in traditions that supposedly had no contact with ancient Israel. From the Greek Titans to various Sumerian demigods and certain fallen figures in Egyptian tradition. None of this confirms such beings existed, but it shows the idea is close to a universal story pattern. A genuinely fascinating anthropological thread. Taken together, the machine's reading suggested something bigger. The Book of Enoch is not a marginal curiosity. It is a fully realized, internally consistent cosmology that tackles the origin of evil, the structure of the spiritual world, and humanity's ultimate fate with more detail than the canonical books ever attempt. Names and stars. The deeper the analysis went, the more specific the text became. Enoch does not merely gesture at a fallen angel narrative, it publishes a roster. Beyond the leader Samjaza, the book describes roughly 200 Watchers who descended together on Mount Hermon. Several of them assigned specific roles. Azel, Armaros, Barakol, Kokoabel, Zachiel, others still. Azel receives particular attention and particular blame. The text credits him with teaching humanity how to forge swords, shields, and armor. Essentially, the technology of war, and with teaching adornment through metal work and jewelry, which the text frames as a corruption of its own kind. Divine judgment lands hardest on Azazel. He is bound, cast into darkness, and left to await final punishment at the end of days. This is where AI analysis of ancient texts earns its keep. Grok drew a direct line from this figure to Leviticus 16, where the ancient scapegoat ritual sends one goat into the wilderness for Azazel, a phrase most Bible readers have encountered and almost none have ever had properly explained. Enoch supplies the missing context. The goat is sent to the bound one, the imprisoned teacher of forbidden arts, carrying the sins his knowledge unleashed. Making that connection manually means working through multiple translations and a stack of academic literature. The machine compressed that process into something an everyday reader could follow and then verify independently. The analysis then turned to the sky. And this may be the most underrated section of the entire book. Chapter 72 through 82, known as the Book of the Luminaries, form one of the oldest layers of the text. Fragments of it turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls dating to roughly 200 BCE. This section tracks the movements of the sun, moon, and stars in remarkable detail for its era. It lays out a 364-day solar calendar built on 4 seasons of 91 days each. distinct from the lunar calendar of most later Jewish practice, but matching the calendar system found in other Dead Sea Scrolls material, including texts tied to the Essen community. That overlap has led some scholars to argue the community behind the scrolls had a direct link to the tradition that produced Enoch. The astronomy is not accurate by modern standards, and the analysis was careful to say so, but it reflects a genuinely sophisticated observational system, one built on patient tracking of the night sky across years. The book describes the sun rising and setting through 6 gates on each horizon. And that corresponds to a real phenomenon because the sun's rise and set points genuinely do shift along the horizon across the seasons. And tracking those shifts was the backbone of ancient calendar making. This section is not mythology in the usual sense. It reads like a systematic empirical account of how the heavens work, written by someone who spent a lifetime watching them. Visions of history. Chapters 83 through 90 contain what scholars call the dream visions. And this is where the text starts behaving less like scripture and more like a coded chronicle. Enoch describes 2 visions. The first is a terrifying preview of a flood wiping out the earth. The second is a long allegorical retelling of history known as the animal apocalypse, in which the major figures of biblical history appear as animals. Adam and Eve as white bulls, the Israelites as sheep, their oppressors as predatory beasts. It reads almost like a storyboard of Israelite history compressed into a menagerie of horns, claws, and wool. Grok's reading of this section leaned on a concept historians call vaticinium z eventu, prophecy written after the events it claims to predict. The analysis flagged that parts of the animal apocalypse are so specific about real moments in Israelite history that they appear to have been composed with knowledge of those events already in hand. That is not a fringe accusation. It is a standard scholarly observation, and it raises real questions about when different sections were written and by whom. Scholars generally date the animal apocalypse to the Maccabean period in the 2nd century BCCE since its coded imagery tracks the Jewish revolt against Susid rule closely enough to serve as a dating anchor for the whole section. But the vision refuses to stop at known history. It pushes forward into a final battle, the defeat of evil and a world remade in peace. The analysis pointed out that this end-time sequence shares clear structural DNA with the Book of Revelation. The same essential arc of tribulation, divine judgment, and renewal. The open question presented without taking sides is whether the author of Revelation drew directly from the Enochic tradition when composing the most famous apocalypse in Western history. The textual overlap is close enough that most scholars answer, yes, the Son of Man. Then comes the part of the analysis that made people sit up because this is where an obscure ancient book collides with the central figure of Western civilization. Chapters 46 through 48 of Enoch describe a heavenly figure called the Son of Man, a being who existed before creation who sits beside God, who will judge the wicked and vindicate the righteous at the end of days. That phrase carries enormous weight because Son of Man is the title Jesus applies to himself more than any other in the entire New Testament. Roughly 80 times across Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In Mark especially, Jesus the phrase in contexts of cosmic authority and final judgment. Contexts that align strikingly with Enoch's version of the figure. Grok's comparison flagged the specific traits Enoch assigns to the Son of Man. Existence before creation, divine authority, the role of final judge, association with light and wisdom. The parallel is not a vague thematic resemblance. It is a point-by-point correspondence. Those traits match what the New Testament claims about Jesus so closely that scholars have argued over the connection for decades. Some believe Jesus deliberately invoked the Enochic title to signal exactly what kind of figure he claimed to be. Others see the influence as more diffuse, absorbed through the religious culture of the time. Either way, this is not a new theory produced by an AI. It has been part of academic theology since the 1800s. It is simply invisible to most churchgoers because the book that defines the title never made it into the Western Bible. A genuine wrinkle surfaced when the analysis was pressed on how solid this connection really is. The section containing the Son of Man material known to scholars as the Book of Parables is conspicuously missing from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Every other major section of Enoch turned up at Qumran in some form, not this one. Scholars take that absence seriously, since it suggests the parables may have developed later or within a different community than the rest of the book. That does not undo the Jesus connection, since the parables were clearly circulating before the end of the 1st century, regardless of what Qumran happened to preserve. But it is exactly the kind of nuance that separates careful scholarship from a tidy talking point. If this investigation is holding your attention, take 1 second and hit subscribe because deep dives like this one are released every week, and the story of how this book vanished is stranger than the book itself. Why it vanished. So why was a book this influential left out? The answer the analysis assembled was layered rather than simple. And the honest version begins with a correction. The Book of Enoch was never officially part of a single universal Bible to begin with. It was excluded from different canons at different times for different reasons, less a single dramatic verdict than a slow quiet drift out of circulation. The rabbinic authorities who finalized the Hebrew Bible in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE left it out possibly because its content, especially the Watcher's narrative and its elaborate angelology, read as dangerous or even heretical during a period when Jewish religious identity was under enormous strain. After the destruction of the Second Temple. On the Christian side, the canon took shape gradually through regional decisions like the Council of Carthage in 397 CE and the canon lists that followed. By then, Enoch had circulated for centuries and had clearly shaped Christian thought, but its vivid fallen angel imagery and sprawling cosmology may have made it awkward to fit inside the theological structure the early church was building. The analysis laid out several scholarly explanations and was clear that no single tidy answer exists. What it flagged as genuinely remarkable is the exception. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, home to one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, never dropped the book because it stood outside the Roman process that defined the Western canon entirely. Whether Enoch was removed or simply never included depends on which tradition is consulted, and that is a quiet but profound reminder. The Bible was never one fixed, universally agreed object. It was, and still is, a set of overlapping decisions made by different communities at different moments in history. The scrolls speak one thing no serious scholar disputes. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls pulled from Cave 4 at Qumran and first studied in depth by Joseph Milik in the early 1950s. Material covers roughly 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts of Enoch itself, spread across a much larger number of individual fragments dated between roughly 200 BCE along with several additional Aramaic manuscripts of a related text called the Book of Giants, which describes the offspring of the fallen Watchers and appears to have circulated alongside Enoch in the same scribal circles. That makes Enoch one of the best represented non-canonical texts recovered at Qumran, with more surviving manuscript witnesses than several books that did make it into the Old Testament. When the analysis was asked how credible the text's history really is, its point was blunt. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove beyond reasonable doubt that the Book of Enoch was widely known, widely copied, and treated as important scripture by at least one major Jewish community during the era of Jesus and his contemporaries. That is not speculation. It is documented archaeology, and the physical evidence is available through the Israel Antiquities Authority's online archive of digitized scroll fragments. The scrolls revealed something else. The astronomical sections found at Qumran are older than the fully compiled version of the book, which suggests different parts of Enoch circulated independently before being stitched together into a single manuscript tradition expanded and rearranged by generations of scribes over centuries. Running underneath all of it is a moral engine. A huge portion of Enoch is devoted to divine judgment, the fate of the wicked, the vindication of the righteous, the eventual downfall of those who abuse power. The analysis of this theme produced some of the richest output of the entire exercise.